Going.
All right. So hi everyone here, and hi everyone on the live stream. So we are kicking off our speaker series here at SICSS Chicago with Erin Shaw today, and Erin is a assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern, and he is also the director of the Media, Technology, and Society program. He is also a faculty associate affiliated with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. And he is also the co-founder of the Community Data Science Collective. His work largely focuses on understanding organization, collaboration, and governance and inequality in online environments. And we're very glad to have him here today, especially so close to the end of the quarter. At Northwestern, we just wrapped up yesterday, I assume, in grading very recently. So we're very glad to have him here with us today. So join me in welcoming Erin.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks. So I might, to those of you on the live stream, apologies in advance. I might run back and forth because my laptop with my speaking notes is about 10 feet over that way. So if you lose sight of me, that's why. I'll try to project and speak clearly so that the microphone can still pick me up. So what I wanted to do today was just share a short synthesis of some recent work that I've been doing together with, primarily with Benjamin Mako Hill, who's at the University of Washington in the Department of Communication, but also with some PhD students, both at Northwestern and at the University of Washington, and now with a few folks who have graduated from those places and moved on to faculty jobs at other places too. So the synthetic part of this is definitely a work in progress and is something that Mako and I have been developing over the last year or two. And so would love feedback, would love ideas for ways to sort of flesh out some of the empirical support or testing for some of the ideas. But in the process, I'll try to tell you a little bit about, I'll try to emphasize some of the kind of ways that our group does the work that we do, because I think what you'll see ultimately is that a lot of what we do is very much in the mode of sort of classic social science theories and hypothesis testing and a lot of that. But the data that we're collecting, the ways that we're analyzing it, is often at sort of computational scale and or using computational tools. And if there's time, depending on what kind of questions and things like that we get, I had a little sort of slightly more interactive exercise in mind to try to spur your thinking about the tools and processes that you do to do your work. I know it's early on still in the Summer Institute, so I figured it's a good time to have that sort of overarching conversation that maybe you can take advantage of over the next couple weeks. So, okay. With that as preface, so the work that Mako and I and our students and collaborators do usually focuses on digital commons. And these are sort of online communities, organizations that are producing information resources that are shared in some way over the internet. If you want to have an example in mind, the biggest and the best is probably Wikipedia, which I suspect you're all familiar with. I don't have a lot more to say about that right now, but just the point here is to underscore that it is a sort of public good in a very classic sense, right? It's a resource that is sort of non-rivalrous in the sense that we can make as many copies of it as we want, as long as we can get access to servers that are big enough. We don't diminish the original in any way, and it's non-excludable. In other words, as long as you have an internet-connected device, it's very hard for me to prevent you while I'm talking or while I'm not talking, for example, from going on English Wikipedia or any other language edition of Wikipedia and looking it up. The other part of Wikipedia that's important that may be less familiar or at least less well understood by a lot of you or by other folks out there in the world involves what I would say are some of its most kind of charming attributes. One, which I sort of alluded to already, is that it's free, as in both kind of freedom and beer, as people might say. So it's licensed for free reuse, and it doesn't cost us anything to get to it. The other charming attribute is that it is editable by anyone. right? So what this means is that if, there's a Wikipedia article that, you might encounter out there that you maybe know something about, in this case, an article about a sociologist and professor of sociology at Princeton named Matthew J. Salganik, and you might find that it's lacking in some manner. So in this case, we see there's like a tag here that says that this article needs additional citations for verification. The article is also very short. It doesn't say a lot substantively about the different things that this particular professor has done, even though he is quite noteworthy. The article ends like here. You can't see it because I just cropped it for the screenshot. But if you wanted to, you might click. There's a little button up there that if you can see says edit. You can click that edit button and you are rushed off to this interface, which looks completely confusing and probably foreign to many of you, where you can make changes to the text. And you've got a whole bunch of stuff up here that says that there's a note about sources and that this is subject to some policy about the biographies of living persons. But the important thing here is that this is really about, there's this interface underneath it where there are lots of people interacting to collaboratively produce the resource. And what you can sort of see hints of in here also with all of this jargon is that there are lots of complicated policies, rules. There's a whole organizational structure underpinning this. And that's really the focus of what we're working on, right? We're trying to understand what are the organizational features that enable the growth, creation, sustainability, maintenance, dissemination, and quality of these kinds of resources out there in the world. Let me jump over here, make sure I'm not forgetting too much. All right. Hopefully I didn't forget too much. So the overarching big picture of this is that this larger phenomenon, we talk about it as something called peer production, or commons-based peer production. The term was originally coined by a guy named Yochai Benkler back in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. But it encompasses English Wikipedia and every other language edition of Wikipedia that you've heard of. But it turns out Wikipedia, indeed all the Wikipedias, of which there are almost 300 at this point, over a dozen of which have over 1 million articles. They've got, millions of edits and millions of editors. But it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? And these are often projects like GitHub or Reddit, where there are additional projects within them, right? So Stack Exchange is another example. So there are these kind of communities or software systems that host many, many communities. Right? And we can start thinking about these individual communities or projects as organizations, or at least as attempts to create organized collaboration in some form. And so that's exactly what we do. We gather all the trace data that we can from sort of populations of these communities, and we try to build theories or elaborate theories, build models, test models, draw inferences about them, and ultimately produce a better understanding of how they work or don't work, as the case is for most of them. Lately, we've been really focused on thinking about the relationship between production and governance in these environments. And this comes out of a few lines of thinking. It's pretty deeply informed by the work of Elinor Ostrom, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist / political scientist. Funny story there is that she applied to be an economist in PhD programs, was told she didn't know math well enough, so she said, well, screw you guys, I'll go do political science, and later won a Nobel Prize in economics anyway. So for those of you keeping score at home, I think that's Ostrom 1, economics nothing. But the point is that Ostrom really tried to understand how the governance of collaborative, kind of autonomous communities worked in relation to producing different kinds of public goods. Usually these were public goods that were sort of terrestrial resources like clean air, water, rights over fishing, and other kinds of natural resources that sort of existed in the world but needed to be managed effectively so that they wouldn't be kind of overgrazed or exhausted in some form. We're trying to think about how to extend these ideas to talk more about informational public goods, or the kinds of public resources that we get when we collaborate and produce shared knowledge goods. Now, if you want to think about this in the context of Wikipedia here, this is a graph drawn from English Wikipedia. Just gonna make sure I haven't forgotten too much here. Yeah, so English Wikipedia and all of the Wikipedias experienced sort of exponential growth from the time they were created in 2001, right up until about, in the case of English Wikipedia, 2007, when there was some sort of weird peak, and then we get this kind of decline pattern over time. Now this is looking at active editors, which for our purposes is something like people who make at least 5 contributions a month, which is a measure that the community developed over time. And so if we want to think about producing these kinds of public goods and how to sustain them, this graph keeps the people who care about English Wikipedia up at night quite a bit, right? We've got this declining count of active editors, which in absolute terms, if this really does hit 0, right, the information on there needs to be updated. It's not like there's exhaustive coverage of everything possible on English Wikipedia yet. And you could imagine a real sort of resource quality decline that could go along with this. Yeah, we have a question.
Oh yeah, I was just curious how this relates to what you showed before, where it said a citation needed or an edit needed. Like, how does this graph relate to the number of edits?
Yeah. So every edit, anytime you make any change to any page on English Wikipedia, whether it's fixing a comma or adding a paragraph about, a book by Matt Salganik, it counts. If you just edit, click save once, that's one edit. So if I had changed a comma, clicked save, that would be one edit. If I did that 5 times in a month, that would put me on this graph as 1 point, as one editor who was an active contributor for that month, right? So, so what you've got here is this exponential growth in the number of people doing that at least 5 times a month that then enters into a stage of decline. Does that help? Yes, very cool. These are the 8 largest language editions for Wikipedias. And if you are in the back, you don't even have to squint. If you're in the front, you may have to squint a little bit. But what you can see is that while the timelines are all a little bit different, we've demarcated the dots here, indicate the peak of English language Wikipedia for all of them. But what you've got is from 2001 to 2018 is the same measure of active editors, the same y-axis. It's scaled differently because these language editions are all different sizes. Right, Japanese Wikipedia and Polish Wikipedia are not the same size as English Wikipedia, but they are quite big. They're among the 8 biggest. Right, you get a very similar story where there's this initial growth phase followed by some sort of plateau. Looks like, maybe it's like a logistic thing, or maybe entering some sort of decay stage. Right, and the point of showing you this version is that there may have been some of you who were trying to think of explanations already as to why that was happening with English Wikipedia. And one theory would be that it's something particular to that language community or that editor community or the content of that encyclopedia or that point in time. Maybe there was something special about early 2007, right? It turns out Facebook got really, really big right around then, was a popular explanation for a while. The point of this is that makes it pretty hard to sustain that explanation across all of these language editions when many of them are experiencing a very similar sort of overarching shape of the curve of active contributor base at very different points in time, at very different scales, with very different communities of editors and language speakers, and just in lots of different ways, right? And there are different rules in these different communities too. In another project led by Nate Blunthuis, who's a PhD student at the University of Washington, we collected data from the largest, it turns out 1%, the 1% of wikis on another platform called Wikia, which is now sort of known as Fandom. They've rebranded it as Fandom. And they host wikis on a variety of topics. They don't need to be encyclopedias or even encyclopedic in scope. There can be things like fan fiction, or there's one you may have heard of called Academic Jobs Wiki, which is pretty popular among a very small community of editors. But the point is that these are wikis that are attempts to create these kinds of collaborative public information resources. They're licensed the same way as Wikipedia. They're using the same software. And here what we've done is we've standardized for the active editor count using the same kind of measure across all of these, but so that we could throw it all on one axis here. So in standard deviation units over relative age for all the different communities, and we get a curve that looks remarkably similar overall. We've got some early growth stage, which seems to stabilize and enter into a stage of decline when we look across the largest 1% are about 800 different wiki communities, none of which were included in those initial graphs I showed you. All right, so to step back here, and let me go look over here for a sec. To step back here for a minute, you know, the question that we kept running into when we were having these kinds of findings and others were finding these kinds of patterns too, was what's going on, right? These kinds of communities are generally characterized as being incredibly open, right? In the sense of, I would say in the sense of the institutions that are there and the organizational sort of structure. Indeed, when they first start, there's really no organizational structure and usually very little in the way of formal institutions. But what we kept finding over and over again, and what others kept seeing, was that this openness would sort of wind up in some pattern of what looks a lot more like closure. And so we started exploring that a lot more deeply. And it turns out that what we and others have found in this sense is that indeed this pattern of closure is more widespread than just a decline in active contributor base, right? You know, and I'm going to literally put a pile of papers on the right-hand side of the screen here and not talk about them in any depth. If you want to talk about them more, happy to later. Some of them are by us, some of them are by other people. But to summarize the findings, basically, as these communities grow, they become more formalized and more bureaucratic. There's, you know, multiple kinds of findings about this from different kinds of communities as well. We find that the governance of them becomes more concentrated. There's less turnover. They fit a sort of a certain definition of oligarchy. So this was a paper that Mako and I wrote that we published back in 2014, that it seemed like there was this kind of oligarchification happening within these kinds of wiki communities, and that they become more difficult to contribute to. When newcomers show up there, it's harder for them to make contributions effectively. Their contributions that they do make are more likely to be removed, and the newcomers are more likely never to come back again. Yeah, there's another one. So again, the question that really that a lot of this raised for us and that we've struggled to try to start answering more effectively is why. And to explain why, or give you at least the big picture of our best explanation right now, we've tried to step back a little bit more and think about what it is these communities are trying to do as commons producing and commons governing organizations. And we've started thinking about the idea that there are sort of two goals that are overarching for all of these communities. One is that when they start, there's nothing there. When English Wikipedia first went online, there were no articles, there was no text. Right? When a new free software project gets started, there's no code base. So the first thing these communities have to do is build something, and the second thing they have to do, often in overlapping in time, is manage that something, right? Manage that resource or that stock of value. And so you can think about this as two different classes of problems that have had different roles in the traditional literature on public goods and organizations. One is that to think about the first one is a mobilization problem, right? So this is really where, you know, theories like the logic, you know, things around the logic of collective action or theories of critical mass, for those of you who might work in those spaces, or theories about social movements and social movement organizations are really important for understanding what has to happen. And the second part is around governing appropriation, right? And so this brings us back to Eleanor Ostrom and her theories about, you know, how lobster fisheries manage to not run out of lobsters in Maine and Nova Scotia every year. And so if we think about that more generally, which, did you have a question? Okay, you're just tracing the curves, yeah. What we've tried to do is start thinking about that more generally and actually build an analytic model to explore that space and explore the trade-offs that may come from that. So I'll tell you more about what the axes don't mean, or like where these curves come from. But the point is that this is just summarizing the relationship I've told you about so far. So the top graph is the y-axis is contributions or contributors. Doesn't matter, you just scale it differently, it looks the same. The second one is the relative sort of openness or the kind of permeability of the community. That could be in terms of the boundaries of participation. That could be in terms of the extent of the rules and regulations or their enforcement. And over time, what we've observed so far is that the contributions go through this steep growth and then they enter into some stage of decline or at least decay. And that the openness seems to just sort of decrease over time, right? That's the current set of findings we've got. And so far, the only thing we're adding is thinking about this stock of value or this pool of resource that's underneath there and saying that that can sort of increase over time underneath all of this, right along with it. And so one way to think about this is both in the pool of the resource itself, right, the sort of articles that you're used to looking at on English Wikipedia, but the resources are also partly the institutions and the organization themselves. Right, the fact that we, or at least I, will, often trust what's written on English Wikipedia pages, at least to some degree, right? I mean, it's important to read critically, check the citations, look at the edit history, make sure nobody's vandalized recently. But overall, like that trust and that goodwill that I feel towards that institution, some of you may have donated to the Wikimedia Foundation when they asked for money, right? You think about the trust that you have in that resource, that's part of the stock of value that community has built over time as well. And the other point that we're bringing out here is that some of this value may be sort of appropriable in the sense that lobster fisheries can be exhausted. It may be possible to sort of undermine the resource in an information good in a similar way, even though, right, the bits that are sitting on the servers at the Wikimedia Foundation, I can copy them as many times as I like and I can't exhaust those, right? So, okay, so the relationship that we've got then is that as the community first starts, we've got, if we're doing things right, if everything goes like the best possible way it could, we've got a growth in contributions, a growth in the stock of value, and as some rules and routines get established, an initial decrease in the kind of relative level of openness. And then over time, we've got this sort of second phase that I've been telling you about, where we see the contributions or contributor base sort of decrease a little bit, the openness declines even further, and the stock of value stays high, in part because what we're doing by reducing the openness is we're managing the resource, right? So just to reiterate what appropriation can look like, because I think this part is really important, especially because it's not usually what people talk about when they talk about information goods. They think information goods, we can just copy it as many times as we want, it doesn't matter. This is an article about Jeremy Renner, who I don't know very much about personally. You may. It turns out he's an American actor, singer-songwriter, and a velociraptor, according to this version of the article. This is an archival version of the article. It's not the current edition. It turns out that Jeremy Renner, this article has been sort of defaced in this way many times. This is the edit history from back in 2013, and each of the little highlighted edits, right? So that each of these is an edit. We were talking about this before. Each of these highlighted edits is somebody finding an instance where somebody changed his biography to describe him as a velociraptor, and then it was changed back, right? So the best we can figure out is that there was some meme on Reddit involving Jeremy Renner being a velociraptor, and that basically resulted in a lot of people vandalizing his page in a sort of not quite coordinated way. But the point is that this really imposes a cost on the community, right? If you find a Wikipedia article where an American actor is described as a velociraptor, that may raise some doubts for you about the quality of the other articles you read. But it also took time, right? I mean, some of these are edits by bots. I don't know if you can see, but this is an automated reversion because they think that there was vandalism in the previous edit because they saw some patterns, that bot identified some patterns that were consistent with that. But most of the rest of these are done by people, right? I mean, these are regular user accounts stating things like Jeremy Renner is not a velociraptor, the velociraptor thing again, stomping velociraptor silliness, right? So these are humans engaging in work to undo this stuff, even though it's just for fun. And that's really important. And if you fast forward a little bit further, what you see happening here is that eventually somebody comes through, this user named Top Banana comes through, and they do something where they protect the Jeremy Renner article because of persistent vandalism related to a Reddit fad, and they protect it indefinitely, which basically means that now anyone who hasn't edited at least 10 times and not been identified as a vandal can no longer edit the article, right? So this is an exact example of the ways in which like the openness of the resource and the fact that it is this like attractive space where if you want to have fun playing with Jeremy Renner's professional identity in public, you go here. has elicited a protective response, essentially a response where the people who care about the community and who are stuck doing the work to clean up the fun, like say, enough is enough, we're closing the door, nobody else can edit this thing. So let's spell out the sort of model here a bit more carefully, just so you can see it written down. The idea here is that each Knowledge Commons has a stock of value and some amount of openness. Those are sort of the starting resources that it has. And for the purposes of what we're doing here, we're trying to now build a simulation of this. So what I'm going to describe now, sorry, I should have prefaced this. What I'm going to describe now is sort of our constructing the simulation. And how are we doing on time? I should just check.
It is 12:06. You're good.
Cool. Okay, awesome.
Plenty of time.
Yeah. We're like 2/3 of the way through the stuff I wanted to show you with this, so we can sort of see how we get once we get through it. But for the purpose of our simulation, which at the moment we're like putting together in Python, it's mostly been Mako working on the simulation part of this project. We're sort of imagining this as each community, going through iterative rounds. And we're going to try to introduce varying levels of complexity to generate some predictions out of this model of how communities work, which we can then go compare against all the data sources that we have to see if the predictions hold up empirically or not. So that's kind of what we're working on right now. So each round, you could think about it as a unit of time or just a sort of iteration. Any project will receive some contributions, which can increase the stock of value, right? Some good faith edits. And they might also receive some damaging edits, some velociraptor edits, or more sort of malicious things, not just playfulness. And in response, projects may change the level of sort of openness or permeability for contributions based on the amount of damage that they get. And so importantly to this, contributions and damage are a positive function of openness and stock, right? The more sort of openness you have and the more of a valuable resource you have, the more likely you are to get both contributions and attract the attention of people who want to call Jeremy Renner velociraptors. Right, so for a particular project, you can imagine at point A, it just gets some randomly generated packet of contributions and damage. Afterwards, they got no damaging edits, they got a few good contributions, so they now have a stock with that many contributions, and they don't restrict contribution because nothing bad happened last time. Why bother making rules if nothing bad happened? This time they get another packet which includes more contributions, but also some bad stuff. And so this time they close down a little bit, their stock is bigger, and you can sort of work out what might happen after that. It turns out with just these sort of relatively simple rules, we're able to produce these kind of simulated curves where, apologies, especially on the live stream, that you probably can't see these at all. If anybody wants the slides, I'm happy to share them. So that goes for people in the room and out of the room. But the top panel shows contributions and damage. So that's kind of the incoming packets of stuff. The middle panel shows the relative openness curve. And the bottom panel shows the underlying stock of value and how it's changing over time. And so the first one there, what we saw was an increase in contributions, which increased the stock of value, and no response in terms of closure and no amount of damage. The second one, we saw a little increase in damage, which resulted in some increase in closure. And if you sort of let it run through many, many rounds, this is what we get. And the nice thing about this so far is that it does reproduce that sort of general curve we saw about the closure that communities undergo over time, restricting the influx of contributions, but and also restricting the influx of damage without sort of deleting the underlying stock of value. Or actually, we've constructed it, so I can't do that. So that's not totally fair. But what we're able to reproduce is the shape of the curves that we want. So we started thinking about empirical evidence that might or might not have been found or that could help us understand whether this actually occurred in the world or whether this model was actually consistent with what we were seeing beyond that one set of graphs I showed you about number of contributions or contributors. So one prediction that we got from this is that we would expect damaging contributions to increase as communities grew, whether in terms of contributors or contributions or stock of value. We would expect to see that increase. And we poked around a little bit, and surprisingly, even though there are thousands of papers published about English Wikipedia every year, and that's just one community among the many that we've tried to study, none of them had actually checked this. Right? There are public data sets about vandalism on English Wikipedia. Nobody had looked. So we plotted it, and it turned out that with the exception of maybe a slight dip in around 2003, there was this underlying relationship. This is like a hand-coded set, so we feel really good about this, the quality of these observations. I forget, did we have another? No, we don't have another curve of this. We're hoping we've got now. There's some automated tools that are also classifying this, and we're hoping we can generate a bigger version of this. But again, this is just English Wikipedia, and we see the pattern that we would expect to see in terms of the increase in damage as the community was growing during that initial sort of growth stage of the project. Oh, and the other thing I should mention about this is that this is a proportional y-axis, so it's actually quite large. At the beginning, when there was not much on English Wikipedia, this is not a big deal. By 2010, over 30% of the incoming contributions are crap, or at least later declared to be crap. Right? That's an incredible volume of bad stuff coming in the door, or stuff that people determine at least is low enough quality that they want to just remove it outright later on. So that's an important thing to emphasize about that graph. Another question that we couldn't find better answers for, other than what kind of we had looked at in a few cases with wikis, was whether commons became less open as they grow. There's a typo there, sorry about that. So this is, I remember I talked about that Jeremy Renner incident and where it resulted in page protection. This was one of these funny things where it turned out Mako and I had actually built a tool to record page protection events in Wikipedia, but had never looked at it in sort of aggregate fashion. So once we had this question, we went back and looked at our own data. It turns out that page protection, so this is, one way to think about this is that these are specific incidents where the community is deciding to close individual pages graphed over time. And so this case, the page protection data is no good before 2005. The reasons don't really matter, but what you can see is that we've got this relatively stable, after a little while, rate of page protection events, indicating that the kind of closure incidents that we were looking for did go up relatively early on, but seem to have stabilized since the community kind of peaked in terms of contributor base. And then a really important question here, a prediction from our model, was that decreases in openness, so in other words, introducing kind of institutional structure and closure like those page protection events, what impact would that have on both good faith contributions or quality contributions and damaging contributions? Our prediction would be that it would decrease both, right? And so this is just one result from a study that is forthcoming in communication research. Hopefully later this year. We're just polishing up the manuscript still. But this was a quasi-experimental study where we had about 150 communities that one day to the next went from allowing people to contribute without accounts to requiring an account to sign in and edit, right? So not real name policies or anything so structured as that. Totally pseudonymous. You can use throwaway accounts. You don't have to have complicated passwords. But one day to the next, it went from sort of being more permeable, more open, to being more closed across all of these communities. So, and it happened at different points in time. The communities are about different topics. Again, these are fandom or Wikia wikis. And these were at different sort of relative stages of size and growth and institutional development across the different communities. And so we line all of those up around a relative sort of x-axis here of time. So this is weeks relative to the transition. The dotted line is the point at which they implement the change. And the top panel shows damaging contributions, or contributions which are later deemed to be damaging, which are reverted. And the bottom panel shows non-reverted, or contributions that are left alone, presumably because they're decent enough to sort of pass muster with subsequent contributors. And we do in fact see a decrease that's quite substantial across both. You might note, for those of you who can read it, that the top panel, the y-axis, is quite, the scale is quite small. It only goes up to about 6 damaging contributions per week. That's because the average community in fandom or Wikia actually doesn't get so many bad faith contributions. At the very, very large end of the spectrum, they do get many, right? Keep in mind, every variable in our data set is distributed like massively skewed from millions to 0. And most of the action is like somewhere out at the fat end of the tail. So this is aggregating across all of those, which is why the average is quite small. The good faith contributions go from about 600 per week to about 400 per week. Both decreases, I think the upper decrease is around 75% as a proportion, and the lower decrease is around 40%. I can double check those numbers if anybody really wants to geek out about it. Right, so concluding thoughts about all of this, right? When we look at these kinds of patterns across hundreds or thousands of communities, what we're finding is essentially this overarching relationship between openness and contribution to information goods and resulting institutional closure and formalization and bureaucratization, right? So leading to some pattern of, you know, at least curtailed growth or decay in participation rates. And theoretically, we think this is interesting and important in part because it helps bridge two sets of theories that have been very influential in this space. Right? The work of Manker Olson on the one hand, who helped explain how you might incentivize contributions to public goods, how you might mobilize participation, and the work of Eleanor Ostrom, who really thought about how you could govern those kinds of resources once they existed. And I think, at least to our understanding, people have sort of collapsed the relationship between these two theories in a lot of ways historically. And we think that part of the exciting thing about this work is that it gives us an opportunity to disentangle them a little bit in relation to these kinds of communities and organizational efforts. The second thing that comes out of this is really related to the specific context that we're in some ways, which is that this kind of closure and structuring, structuration if you're a Giddens fan, is a kind of adaptive response. It's not some, right, I think the people who are sort of native to the world of wikis and free and open communities on the internet think that closure is sort of ethically bad or maybe like a contradiction of ideals or beliefs. And I think that part of what we're finding here is that in fact, it is kind of a natural or at least naturalizable response to the threats and constraints that the communities operate under. And that suggests that there are lots of different ways you could think about it, but that thinking about it as aberration or a violation of principles may cause more problems than you need to, in the sense that it forces you to, if you're not willing to take these kinds of steps, your community may struggle to survive even more. I'm sure I've lost my train of thought here. Yeah, so I mean, I think that what we're working on now is developing more predictions out of these kinds of models to think about how we might understand the trade-offs that are entailed by these processes over time among these kinds of organizations. And that for communities to succeed and sustain public resources in this way, we assume at this point that they're going to have to navigate these trade-offs. Or in other words, that it's not as easy as you could just sort of persist in being radically open, right? Or just sort of imagine that you could walk back and say, no, we should have built Wikipedia as a top-down hierarchical organization, right? People forget at this point that they tried that before. Encyclopedias were a whole industry that existed for a long time, and Wikipedia blew them all away, right? We don't have an encyclopedia industry anymore. The winner is clear in some sense. So if you want, if you think those kinds of resources are valuable, and if you don't, please come talk to me. I'll try to convince you otherwise. But if you think those kinds of resources are valuable, or that those kinds of public goods are worth protecting and preserving at some level, then developing theories to help navigate those trade-offs is a really critical way that we think this kind of empirically driven, data-informed social science can support the survival of that kind of organizing activity. So those are some people who helped us with this in various ways. And would love to take questions, and would also love to talk about some of the workflow and tools that we use to do this kind of research. So I'm not sure what the best way to handle that is, but thanks very much for your attention, and online too. So I've got one hand. What do we want to do? Just a process check-in since we're running behind schedule. What do we want to do time-wise?
Yeah, I think if we go to 12:30, and then if anyone wants to talk to you over lunch, they can.
We can hang. Okay, cool. So we've got 10 minutes. So let's do questions for a few minutes, and I'll leave like 3 minutes at the end to sort of say something about like process and workflow and the tools that we use to do this with. So yes, please.
Yeah, no, this is super interesting. So I guess, so I guess one thing I'm kind of curious about is that this is going to sound a little out here,
Great.
but I'll go back in there. So imagine you were just graphing the consumption of dots by a Pac-Man player, right? And what you would do is you would see a similar curve, right? Because
Nice.
what you do is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit knowledge.
Yep.
It's really easy to contribute to stuff, and then it moves from general knowledge to specialized knowledge, where it's like you really have to know nuanced things about situations or about an actor. And whatnot.
Sure. Or about Matt
And
Saligonic.
so, to a certain degree, how can you partial out? You would expect the same curve, right? Like from versus this kind of open source switching to policing thing. And so I guess there's one that's like, A, how do you parse those two potentially data generating processes out from one another? And then B, it's like, to what scale do you need policing to see what you would see? You know what I'm saying? So this is happening on every single page. Like, how many moderators or gatekeepers do you need to actually expect that's the driver versus just that, low hanging fruit got eaten up. Now it's harder to publish.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, part of I don't think I have a great answer to the first part. I think I have a slightly more satisfying to me at least answer to the second part. To the second part, I would say the best strategy we've come up with is something like these kinds of quasi-exogenous, or as if random interventions, which really allow us to see, immediately before, immediately after. Basically, borrow from economists largely, but at this point, it's the quasi-experimental methods have diffused pretty widely, and what that gives us leverage on is we can see, before and after a shift in one lever. Right, we just are isolating, right? In that case, it's the closure of the boundaries. It's definitely not that something changed instantaneously about the base of knowledge that they were trying to build, right? So, we have a few other studies in the works that are taking advantage of things like that. And I think that one really great thing with a lot of these online communities is that because they've got these exhaustive trace records, if you've got a theoretical lever that you want to understand, there's a pretty good chance you can find some historical case or I think with all the caveats that came up in Matt's last lecture as I was sitting there hearing him talk about ethics and managing relationships with data sources, I think those are real concerns. But oftentimes, if you've got a sort of non-intrusive, non-problematic intervention that you want to test, there's a good chance that some company out there wants to test it too. And I think that's been really effective for us in terms of trying to identify, when we can, the effect of specific changes that allow us to leave other things on the floor in more compelling ways. In terms of so that's a partial answer to both. I think that for the thing that I take the most kind of support for the story I've told you from so far is the fact that we've seen the patterns we've seen across communities that are so different in terms of scope and focus and age and size and topic and language and sort of organizational culture and, more macro social ideas of culture, right? And so if all of those potential sources of variation are not undermining the shifts we've seen, and right, to emphasize, right, a lot of these wikis are like the world's knowledge in Polish is not like different than the world's knowledge in English, and yet that encyclopedia is orders of magnitude smaller, right, which might just be a function of the number of contributors, but like, are there really fewer ideas in Polish, right? Why should we see the same curve? It's not that there are fewer ideas in Polish, right? Like, let's just, there aren't. So something else is happening. And I think that's why we've tried to focus at least our understanding and inquiry on the organizational features and those aspects of it. But I think there's definitely, I agree. There's also some story about the decreasing opportunities or the decreasing ease of contribution that I think you're right. There's some piece of that that's there too. That just hasn't been the focus of what we've looked at. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
I had a question about like the decay that you're seeing. Is there any prominent example that you looked at where that decay like goes all the way or towards zero, or is it like still sort of wait to see?
Sputtering along. I mean, I think the prominent cases, I mean, there are definite cases where some particular, I'm thinking of some particular free software projects and other communities online have sort of collapsed. I think, you know, and you can, it's not just the ones that are producing sort of Creative Commons licensed stuff that you might think about here. You know, there are lots of, the internet's filled with like corpses of communities, right? So like, I don't know, anybody edit MySpace recently? Like, you know, or Dig, right? I mean, all the things from your past, or the internet's collective past. You know, one thing that we think is interesting in this space too is that as these kinds of communities, the ones that are producing things that are freely and publicly licensed, have grown, we think that, you know, some of the venture-funded spaces have gotten more sophisticated about figuring out how to benefit from the kinds of community dynamics that these communities have supported. So a great example there, and where you can really see these kinds of competition dynamics in play more effectively, is like something like Airbnb and Couchsurfing. Where, so if you're not familiar, Couchsurfing basically was a site that was a network for supporting exactly what you might guess it was there to support, which is like, you know, helping people like find someone's couch to sleep on in another place. You look at the user base of Couchsurfing, and it sort of is, you know, going up over time, and then Airbnb comes on the scene and just eats Couchsurfing's lunch. And that's partly because Airbnb is doing a lot of the things that Couchsurfing does, but it's got a prettier user interface, and it also introduces some other things that make it easier to manage these kinds of exchanges by like keeping them kind of arm's length and basing them around money, and kind of providing some support around that makes a lot of people comfortable traveling that they might not have been comfortable doing in a more voluntaristic model. So I think, you know, there's some larger questions that I think we have about whether we'll start to see that decay turn into sort of more die-offs in the spaces that we're looking at. But I think that, like, you know, there are lots of examples of internet-based communities that have collapsed over time, and it usually is because everybody goes somewhere else. So that's the, yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have sort of like a bigger picture question, I guess. I'm just curious as to, you know, your thoughts on the link between anonymity and inequality in these collaborative online environments.
Inequality in what sense?
Inequality in terms of who gets represented on the site and whose contributions are acknowledged on the site.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
both on like the front end and back end, I suppose.
Oh boy. I don't know if I have any like deep thoughts about that. I'm curious what the motivation for your question is in some ways. I mean, I think that there's I think for a lot of these communities, there's a complicated relationship with sort of identity and identifiability and participation in general. I think that for many of these communities, the ability to remain, you know, pseudonymous or at least somewhat anonymous probably enables some forms of participation that wouldn't be there otherwise, but can also lead to sort of cultural, like community cultures that become exclusive, right? And a lot of this process where the culture of a community formalizes and stabilizes often means that it's to the exclusion of some people, or at least in ways that make it less likely that some people will feel comfortable or capable or willing to bother to participate. And very often, at least as far as I understand it, the people who are uncomfortable, incapable, or unwilling to bother contributing are people who come from sort of socially disadvantaged backgrounds already. So I think there's, you know, the broader sort of like the sort of nested sets of dynamics that are producing those outcomes in different ways, I think is still, you know, it's only kind of understood in piecemeal as far as I can tell. You know, I've done some other work looking more in depth at sort of who participates in communities like Wikipedia, and the factors that may help explain sort of demographic like socioeconomic background aspects of inequality in terms of who shows up on the site. And those are sort of overlaid by these community dynamics that are producing sort of prevailing viewpoints and understandings that then lead a very small clump of participants to often have a very large outsized influence over what rules get made and how they get enforced. And so I don't have a good overarching picture for it, but that's a partial answer maybe. Yeah. Maybe one last one. Yep.
Yeah, I guess finding structure, so what you have is a nice example of a structural break in the data where you did this continuity on it.
Yeah.
And I mean, do you have any insights on how you locate those stuff in mainly large observational time series data where, things that you've kind of.
That we've learned from this? Yeah, and that's a good segue to thinking more operationally about this work anyway. I would say that, the big thing since we're working with observational data from online communities is that in these cases, the institutions and the rules and the social structure, such as it is often instantiated in code. And a beautiful thing about code is that it gets changed and it breaks. Beautiful from the point of view of like opportunities, being an opportunistic social scientist, right? So in these cases, people made, for a few people, it was an intentional change that was implemented. That only a very tiny subset of individuals were even aware of. Nobody knew exactly when it was going to happen, except for the person who had programmed the server that the change was deployed on subsequently, right? So that was a nice thing to look for, was to basically talk to people in the communities, learn about changes that had been made, identify a few that spoke to us as theoretically salient, and then dig in and find and build the data sets around that we needed. So that was really good. Other examples I've seen are when features break, unexpected outages, sudden configuration changes. All of these things are opportunities to identify quasi-exogenous shifts. And I think that there's a real opportunity to think about those more creatively in between online and offline spaces as well. And I think some of that work is there now. Things like, I've seen some experiments. I think Michael Coomer and some colleagues, he's at Georgia Tech in I forget what they call it there. It's the analog to their School of Management. He and some colleagues have done some work where they've changed the article text of Wikipedia pages for small towns in European countries, improved them basically by taking text that was in the French edition and putting it in the German edition, or in the German edition and putting it in the English edition. And randomly assigned those improvements, and then measured tourism revenue to those towns in the following year to identify the economic impact of Wikipedia contributions on tourism. It's really brilliant, right? It's really clever. There might be some problems with that study, whatever. Those of you who are more sophisticated that can figure them out. But I think, there are real opportunities, whether you're doing an RCT in that kind of way, or taking advantage of, there's some other work where people have looked at sudden data sources being released into the public domain. Right? Every year, whether you're aware of it or not, there's a batch of data that shifts from being protected under copyright and other forms of intellectual property protection to going into the public domain. Someone who I know who's worked with this stuff is a guy named Abhishek Nagaraj, who's at the Haas School of Management at Berkeley. And who's taken advantage of that to understand the impact of sort of public accessibility of knowledge goods on the way that they get used in various settings, right? So I think looking for those kinds of shifts, right? It's just sort of an extension of some of the other work I've seen. Political scientists, whoever first came up with the idea to look just above and just below 50% for an electoral cutoff to understand the effect of winning an election on something, right? Like, once you start to think of a few of these, you'll come up with your own that help in your particular research context. So yeah, the last thing I'll add, and we're a tiny bit over, but I'll just say that what I was going to talk about related to, whatever, we'll leave it off the screen. What I was going to talk about, and what I'm happy to talk about over lunch or whatever related to workflow, is I think that for many of you who are at relatively early stages of graduate school, this is a really great time to think about the tools that you are using and how those can sort of help facilitate the different aspects of your work. For our group, we try to use, surprise, surprise, we try to eat our own dog food. We use a lot of sort of free and open tools and try to contribute free and open resources. But I think over the course of your time in this workshop, what I would really encourage you to do is think about the kinds of goals you have for the work outputs that you're generating, right? So whether that's some of the features that you have already been talking about earlier around, sort of conducting work that's ethical and transparent in important ways, or reproducible in other ways, right? If I wanted to really geek out, I could give you like a tour of some of our Git repositories. But I think you have a huge opportunity to really invest now in the kinds of workflow tools that you're using. And I don't know if there's a place in the schedule to talk more about that today or another day, but I'm happy to talk about that more with other folks. And I think that can't emphasize, for me, I went from being basically a humanist in my undergrad education to trying to learn to adopt computer science tools to do the work that I wanted to do. And I think that that's been a really valuable transition for me. And so hopefully I can talk more about that with you over lunch. So that's it. See you all later. Thanks. And thanks to everyone on the live stream too. See you later.